There we go. We should be live now. How is everybody doing today? There we go. All right, let me go mute myself now that I know that I'm live. Yeah, Michael, no problem. I'll see you later. And yes, your Minds article I appreciated it. Dan, it's good to see you. I'm doing well. I'm glad to get this book club thing finally started. So hopefully more people will start coming in and we'll get started. I hope everyone is enjoying their Monday so far. Want to join my Christian Discord server? Pedro, I did get your DM about that. That would require me to use Discord way more than I already do. So, I mean, for me, I would have to get in the habit of actually using Discord. Not that I'm opposed to it. I have an account for this channel and this persona I have. So I would just have to force myself to get into it. I'm not opposed. Hi, Michael. It's good to see you. Dan, I'm feeling pretty damn prudent myself. Amen. Well, here we all are. I'm so glad that I'm finally getting this started. So this is Prudent Reads. This is going to hopefully be the start of a monthly book club sort of review and reading live stream that I want to do on a monthly basis. I did put out a Twitter poll a few weeks ago talking about which next book we're going to go over, which that'll be the Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. That was the overwhelming poll answer, I think over 50%. So March 1st is when we'll be doing that. I'm already started reading it, and it's been a pretty good read so far, although I'm a few pages in. Pager says we're doing Bible studies to help each other find good churches, and we also try to convert atheists. Well, that's definitely worthwhile. Is it non-denominational or is it a variety of Christian faiths? I'm curious because there are definitely some other Christians and Catholics that you might want to reach out to that would probably benefit from a Discord server that's proselytizing. But welcome everybody. So yeah, this is Prudent Reads. I'll be going over my thoughts on what I had read over the last month or so, and do some readings, and then talk about just interact with you guys on thoughts and opinions on the book that we've read. Odds that you'll ever do Guns, Germs, and Steel. Well, if the viewers vote on it, which I'll put another poll out next towards the end of this month. That one's included. I have a copy of Guns, Germs, and Steel. I read it years ago, so it will most likely be on the foreseeable future. And while we're here, actually, let me go tweet that I'm live, because I did not do that. Let's go do that right now. Copy link. And we're live. Okay. All right. Now that I got that knocked out of the way, we can get started. So my copy of Reflections on the Revolution in France is a paperback copy I got off Amazon from Anodos Books, Anodos. Just a slim paperback copy. My version came out to about, 105 pages. It was a brisk read, although it's a sizable book in terms of how it was printed, since Burke liked to get all of his thoughts out in the ways that he does. And it's a sizable read, but it was thoroughly enjoyable. So I feel like it's important to start at the top and give some context. So Burke wrote this, and it was published as a pamphlet in November of 1790. So we're already well into the French Revolution at this point. The National Assembly has been established. There has already been efforts put down to confiscate funds and land and expropriate said funds and land from the clergy, the Catholic Church, and to essentially have this ran by the Third Estate. which of course at the time was led by business leaders, which was led by attorneys and others that were not necessarily large landowners, but were of the merchant class, peasants, but were also primarily the taxpayers, which of course, if you know anything about the French Revolution, you know that it's primarily caused due to a budgetary crisis, the 7 Years' War, and of course the French assisting the American Revolution had essentially bankrupted the French government, and despite efforts for reform and to levy taxation, as well as to change the current system of interest and to have paper currency in circulation, the public treasury was not was not in a good state. I mean, the most famous of the finance ministers at the time is Jacques Necker, and he is, of course, dealing with the public treasury. He did try to implement some sort of reform, making government finances public, instituting new tax reform, which of course was not necessarily successful, not to mention, of course, loans that were put out that eventually he would run away with when he left the country. So you have, was the French Revolution leftist? Yes. Anyone heavily influenced by Rousseau and heavily influenced by the Enlightenment. And if you have any sort of reactionary leanings, you will understand that the French Revolution is not only a leftist revolution, but it is definitely the embodiment of a liberal Enlightenment revolution. And unlike the American Revolution, which one had the backing of its elites, but the French Revolution had the problem of essentially taking everything that the American Revolution did to its logical conclusion. The American Revolution and its establishment of government, our constitutional order, was meant to ensure a very indirect form of democracy. It was very indirect. There was not as much of the popular wills, whereas the French Revolution and what follows is very much a full-on embodiment of the Rousseau sort of viewpoint of the nature of man and the Enlightenment. And Michael points out that anything that comes out of France ought to be avoided. Thoughts on Carlyle's negative opinion of the Bourbon dynasty. I have not yet read enough of Carlyle to know Carlyle's opinions on the Bourbon dynasty. I have just begun myself to read Carlyle. I am reading through Hero Worship and the Heroic Will of History. So eventually I'll get there, Michael. Don't worry. Although Carlyle's negative opinion of the Bourbon dynasty is, I know, vastly different than Burke's opinion of the French royal family and its his position on it. So I thought that it would be interesting to discuss Burke and himself now that we've sort of talked a little bit about the French Revolution. That, you know, Burke is sort of the foundational figurehead, and especially the reflections on the revolutions in France, which I read this last month, for modern classical conservatism, the idea of slow progressive change and adhering to the tradition. And while, of course, the reactionaries who are far more reluctant to any kind of change and resistant to all-out change, Burke is definitely different in the concept that change can happen and can occur, but we must adhere to tradition. However, I think the thing that Burke doesn't get enough credit for, or doesn't get enough attention, at least when I talk to other people about Edmund Burke, is that Burke differs from Locke and other Enlightenment thinkers in regards to the social contract, as in he believes that no individual has the right to necessarily make these changes without reason, because we are merely on this earth for such a short period of time. And that we are only what we have in the state and what we have in government and our traditions, we inherit them. We are essentially renters of our culture and of our people because we're only here for so long. The state and our government and the nature of how society is organized will be here long after we're gone, which brings us to sort of his most famous quotation of Reflections on the Revolutions in France. And I quote, "Society is indeed a contract. Subordinate contracts for objects of mere occasional interest may be dissolved at pleasure. but the state ought not to be considered nothing better than a partnership agreement in the trade of pepper and coffee, calico or tobacco, or some other such low concern, to be taken up for little temporary interest, and to be dissolved by the fancy of the parties. It is to be looked on with other reverence, because it is not a partnership in things subservient only to the gross animal existence of a temporary and perishable nature. It is a partnership in all science, a partnership in all art, a partnership in every virtue and in all perfection. As the ends of such a partnership cannot be attained in many generations, it becomes a partnership not only between those who are living, but between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are to be born. End quote. And that's arguably probably the most famous sentence in Burke's Reflections of the Revolutions of France's political pamphlet, which started out as a letter. In part because he holds that we are inheritors and that the state is going to be there long after we're gone, and that our likelihood of dissolving the state and engaging in revolution is unwise because we are simply one part and parcel owner to it and adhere to this social contract, this liberal concept, Enlightenment concept more so. And we must be hesitant to dissolve it outright. For there are those who came before us who adhere to it, and those who will come long after us who adhere to it. Thank you, Burke. Very cool. Yeah. But I thought that it would be interesting that I would take some quotations and pieces that I thought were interesting throughout the read, and that we would talk about it. I had read this a long time ago, back in my high school and my college days, and which was, of course, a huge influence on me politically, and still does. I mean, Edmund Burke is now the channel persona for this YouTube thing that I'm doing, and he still has a lot of interesting things to say, and I think that they're very valid. So I'm going to start off at the beginning, and you'll probably hear the pages turn as I look for the pages that I want. I wrote them down here. So here we go. I'll start off here, and we'll talk about it as we go on. So, to quote, "A state without the means of some change is without the means of conservation. Without such means, it might even risk the loss of that part of the Constitution which it wished most religiously to preserve. The two principles of conservation and correction operated strongly at the two critical periods of the Restoration and Revolution, when England found itself without a king. At both of those periods, the nation had lost the bond of union in their ancient edifice. They did not, however, dissolve the whole fabric. On the contrary, in both cases, they regenerated the deficit part of the old Constitution through the parts which were not impaired. They kept these old parts exactly as they were. That part might be recovered, be suited to them. They acted by the ancient organized states in the shape of their old organization, and not by the organic molecule of the disbanded people. At no time, perhaps, did the sovereign legislature manifest a more tender regard to that fundamental principle of British constitutional policy than at the time of the Revolution, when it deviated from the direct line of hereditary succession. The crown was carried somewhat out of line, which it had been before it moved, but the new line was derived from the same stock." End quote. And so I thought that that was an interesting line, especially the first sentence about a state without some means of change is without means of conservation. Now, I think for many of us, I think that we can agree on that statement, even regardless of where you lie in politically. If there is no way for us to advance or at least acknowledge the change that comes within technology, within medicine, that's where we're at. And a state that has no ability to move or survive or remove itself of maladaptive traits or even beneficial traits, much in the same way that a bloodline would try to play down maladaptive traits, is most likely not going to survive. And Burke, of course, is commenting on the glorious revolution in England that took place in 1688. If you've read Edmund Burke's work before, then you'll know that a good chunk of the first part of Reflections of the Revolution in France is telling Mr. Dupont, the gentleman who he's writing this letter to in response to the inquiry of Burke's thoughts of what's going on in France, is making comparisons and sort of addressing the issues of what's going on in France by addressing what is called the Revolutionary Society in London. The Revolutionary Society is the most radical sort of political club and organization at the time. They are very much in favor of what's going on in France. They are left-wing in Britain, and they are advocating and supporting very much of what's going on in the National Assembly and are supportive of Robespierre. And he's replying quite a few times throughout the beginning of this letter to, I believe his name is Dr. Reverend Price, who is the leader and one of the more well-known figures of the Revolutionary Society, who has given numerous sermons on the issue of revolution and how the British government should, of course, adopt similar means and policies of what's going on in France towards the UK. They talk about the Revolutionary Society of three fundamental rights that should be adopted, these abstractions, the idea that we should have a government of the people, a government that can be held accountable, and of course the ability to choose those individuals. Burke, of course, lays out several arguments against the Revolutionary Society and hopes to make comparisons of the glorious revolution of 1688 and with dealing with the crown and establishing a new order and a new constitutional order, in addition to what's going on in France, offering a historical, empirical comparison between the two. So, in fact, Burke continues, quote, "The second claim of the Revolution Society is a right of cashiering their governors for misconduct. Perhaps the apprehensions of our ancestors entertained of forming of such a precedent that of cashiering for misconduct was the cause of the declaration of the act which implied the abdication of the King James, was, if he had any fault, rather too guarded and too circumstantial. But all this guard, all this accumulation of circumstances, serves to show the spirit of caution which predominated in the national councils, in a situation in which men, irritated by oppression and elevated by a triumph over it, are apt to abandon themselves to violent and extreme courses. It shows the anxiety of the great men who influenced the conduct of the affairs at that great event to make the revolution a parent of settlement, and not a nursery of future revolutions." End quote. Burke was supportive of the revolution in 1688. He thought that it was a way of maintaining both the crown as well as the society that we inherit. Instead of rights necessarily being divine right or rights that are natural and inalienable, they are rights that are inherited, much in the same way that the bloodline of a king is inherited in order for the crown. The rights that we have as a society are inherited by our bloodline. Which I think is a far more interesting concept. And I think that when we talk about whether that's immigration or cultural issues, I'm surprised that Burke doesn't get mentioned more. But Burke was supportive of it, yes. The pamphlet was essentially to argue why that one was okay and the French one was wrong. Burke's argument in regards to 1688 is more so along the lines of that the revolution of 1688 was in order to prevent future revolution, that there was now precedent in place to ensure that going towards the violent wills of men or what was politically popular at the time doesn't happen in the future, that we have means to necessitate slow change or to redress the issues instead of engaging in violence. He is comparing the two and arguing that 1688 offers a more transitional and settlement means. And in fact, in the quotation I just gave, it's more of a settlement than it is anything else. In fact, he continues and says, "No government could stand a moment if it could be blown down with anything so loose and indefinite as the opinion of misconduct. They who led the revolution grounded their virtual abdication of King James upon no such light and uncertain principle. They charged him with nothing less than a design, confirmed by a multitude of illegal overt acts, to subvert the Protestant church and state, and their fundamental unquestionable laws and liberties. They charged him with having broken the original contrast between king and people. This was far more than misconduct, a grave and overruling necessity that obliged them to take the steps that they took, and took with infinite reluctance, as under the most rigorous of all laws. Their trust for the future preservation of the Constitution was not in future revolutions." See, even there, he talks about the concern of how can we hold people to the idea of misconduct? What does misconduct even mean? It's such a loose and very fallible definition based on the popular wills of the people, which can lead and inspire more revolution in the future, rather than the necessary change that he believes can be done incrementally, in which the glorious revolution of 1688, he believes, provides a template for change. Keep in mind that Burke believes that the system of government that was within the French system and the monarchy, with the Estates General and, of course, the three estates, and with the king, had the mechanisms to provide change and relief, both for the financial problems, the military, and, of course, the overall problems that the Third Estate was having in terms of its representation. He believed that the structure was there to create, meaningful reform. Whereas, the popular wills that we're seeing out of Robespierre at the time, and of course those that were leading the charge and saying that the National Assembly that was now in power was going to control the military, take money away from the clergy, was essentially disrupting everything that allowed the French people to exist as a people. And that's where we're at. And in fact, he continues on with these comparisons of 1688 to what's happening now in France in response to Dr. Price and his sermons. Dr. Price in his sermon states, "His Majesty should be told on occasions in congratulation that he is to consider himself as more properly the servant than the sovereign of his people. For a compliment, this new form of address does not seem to be very soothing. Kings, in one sense, are undoubtedly the servants of the people because their power has no other rational end than that of the general advantage. But it is not true that they are, in the ordinary sense, by our Constitution at least, anything like servants, the essence of whose situation is to obey the commands of some other, and to be removable at pleasure. But the King of Great Britain obeys no other person. All other persons are individually and collectively too under him, and owe him a great legal obedience. The law, which knows neither to flatter nor insult, calls this high magistrate not our servant, as this humble divine calls him, but our sovereign lord the king. And we, on our parts, have learned to speak only the primitive language of the law, and are not the confused jargon of their Babylonian pulpits." End quote. And see, this is where we see Burke's respect for the monarchy and its important aspect there, that we cannot hold kings and those in power as merely servants to the individual, for they have something far more than that. And in respect to the monarchy of the time, of course, there's the divine providence that these men are here for a reason. They are not so much servants to the people as we are servants to them, and we owe them our obedience. We must respect the hierarchy that exists in order for our society and the rights that we enjoy in that society to function. To inverse that relationship, to say that a man in charge is subservient to people that are necessarily below him, makes it all but impossible for governance and those laws to exist in the first place. He continues, quote, "He is not to obey us, but we are to obey the law in him. Our Constitution has made no sort of provision towards rendering him, as a servant, in any degree responsible. Our Constitution knows nothing of a magistrate like the Justia of Aragon, nor of any court legally appointed, nor of any process legally settled for submitting the king to the responsibility belonging to all servants. In this he is not distinguished from the commons and the lords, who, in their several public capacities, can never be called to account for their conduct. Rather, the Revolution Society chooses to assert, in direct opposition to one of the wisest and most beautiful parts of our Constitution, that a king is no more than the first servant of the public, created by it, and responsible to it." End quote. And I like that last sentence there. The wisest and most beautiful part of the English Constitution, a king is no more than the first servant of the public, created by it, and is responsible for it. That we as the public would entrust ourselves into a hierarchy, and entrust ourselves into the leadership of the king. And that is something that we must hold ourselves dearly to. Something, of course, of which liberalism has definitely deviated from, where we hold the idea that individuals are, the shareholders and primarily stakeholders of government, and that those are public servants. Now, there are those, ironically, on the left that are sort of submitting themselves to hierarchy once more. I think there's that viral tweet that's been going around saying, "I am not smarter than Kamala Harris. I am not smarter than Vice President or Joe Biden. I'm not smarter than Nancy Pelosi or Chuck Schumer." And this sort of weird, almost masochistic supplication. And yet it seems that they're embracing hierarchy in almost the exact opposite ways, that they are the servants to these individuals, despite the fact that the people that they would claim are public servants in the traditional American sense of serving us in Congress most oftentimes don't serve us at all. I mean, special interest, fundraising, they are attracted and represent a more established class. There's a comedian whose name escapes me, Colin Quinn, I think is his name, where he talks about how American representation in government in our traditional sense is that poor people yell at the TV, middle-class people will yell and call their congressman, really rich people will call their senator. And, of course, to an extent, that's how it was originally designed. But, I mean, in an era of almost near-universal enfranchisement, you'd think that they'd be far more responsive to the masses, in theory. But, of course, we know that isn't true. But at the same time, I think Burke holds on to some very valued piece of wisdom talking about the English Constitution. That the king is, of course, the first servant of the public and is responsible to it, in part because he is the one who ensures that people are all obeying in laws. DC Perspective says it's practically pushing for serfdom, those people saying, I am not smarter than X, Y, and Z. Yeah, to a degree. Like, you know, it's a weird kind of cyberpunk feudalism in a way where people are supplicating themselves as almost willfully wanting to be serfs. And that's sort of where we're at with a lot of people that I'm seeing now on the left that are commenting about that. But this is where, but Burke continues on in his comparisons now from the Revolution Society in 1688 to what's going on in France. And he starts talking about what's happening there. And I thought that this was an important observation about the French government at the time. Quote, France, by the perfidy of her leaders, has utterly disgraced the tone of the lenient council and the cabinets of princes, and disarmed it with its most potent of topics. She has sanctified the dark, suspicious maxims of tyrannous distrust, and taught kings to tremble at, and what will hereafter be called, the delusive plausibilities of moral politicians. Sovereigns will consider those who advise them to place an unlimited confidence in their people as subverters to their thrones, as traitors who aim at their destruction, by men into a participation of their power, leading their easy good nature under suspicious pretenses, to admit combinations of bold and faithless men into participation of their power. This alone, if there were nothing else, is an irreparable calamity to you and to mankind. Remember that your Parliament of Paris told your king that in calling the states together, he had nothing to fear but the prodigal excess of their zeal in providing for the support of the throne. It is the right that these men should hide their heads. It is right that they should bear part of the ruin, and their council has brought on their sovereign and in their country. Such sanguine declarations tend to lull authority to sleep, to encourage it rashly to engage in the perilous adventures of untried policy, to neglect those provisions, preparations, and precautions which distinguish benevolence from imbecility, and without which no man can answer the salutary effect of an abstract plan of government or freedom. End quote. I think that is a really important comparison there when he's talking about the Estates General being brought together, or the fact that we cannot take people at their word and assuming that their goodwill is all that they are, when in fact, by treating these individuals as, being servants to these people, we're leaving ourselves open to the subversion of the sovereignty and the sovereign of the throne and, of course, authority, which in a way is sort of what we're seeing now in forms of liberal democracy, even here. How can we necessarily take a look at the way that we engage in politics now, lost my train of thought there, how we engage in politics now, especially when we have all these competing groups trying to subvert the other. It undermines the sovereignty of any sort of standing government, in the same way that other nation states look at the United States and know that we're not necessarily trustworthy on national policy, because policy can easily change every 2, 4, and 8 years, because the nature of our plural system of democratic engagement is always about subverting the other side. Politics is a war by non-violent means, although it can inevitably become violent. I think Burke is right when he's sort of lambasting the National Assembly, discussing that these men who are now being lured into the false sense of security by the good intentions of reform and to have free men, in fact, inevitably find themselves being subverted and lose their authority to now the popular wills of abstract concepts which come out of the Enlightenment, inalienable rights, the human right aspect that we see from Rousseau of how men are inevitably all meant to be free. Have I read the English Constitution by Walter Bagehot? A very long time ago, yes. I do have a copy of it, and it was probably my mistake for probably not reading it for this stream. But like I said, this is the first time that we're doing it, and so I think that in the future I will probably also have to do more reading of supplemental material in order to do well. But yeah, for instance, they talk about Burke's comments about abstractions continues. Quote, "This was unnatural. The rest is in order. They have found their punishment in their success. Laws overturned, tribunals subverted, industry without vigor, commerce expiring, the revenue unpaid, yet the people impoverished, a church pillaged, and a state not yet relieved. Civil and military anarchy made the constitution of the kingdom, everything human and divine, sacrificed to the idol of public credit. National bankruptcy the consequence, and, to crown all, the paper securities of new, precarious, tottering power, the discredited paper securities of impoverished fraud and the beggared rapine, held out a currency for the support of an empire, in lieu of two great recognized species that represent the lasting conventional credit of mankind, which disappeared and hid themselves in the earth from whence they came, and when principle of property, whose creatures and representatives they are, was systematically subverted," end quote. And of course, I mean, this is what we're seeing from the National Assembly at this time in 1790. Most of the aspects of the Estates General is gone. We're calling for the abolition of the monarchy. We're putting in together a unicameral form of political representation. In fact, Burke lambasts this later inside the pamphlet when he talks about the fact that there's no such Senate, there's no House of Lords, and that's incredibly problematic for the different classes inside French and, of course, English society. And he comments that even the Americans have a Senate. And so we see this now. The idea of willing ourselves to these abstractions and ignoring the long-standing traditions, both of the people and, of course, the culture that is coming from our forebears and our forefathers, to be thrown out has only led the French people into this abject form of anarchy and national poverty. So far, I've been enjoying Burke's comparison of the Revolution Society because it has allowed him to not only address his criticisms that exist at home, but of course make apt comparisons to what's going on abroad. But we're gonna move ahead now to where we're talking about later in the pamphlet. I thought that there was some interesting observations in terms of government, especially when he's talking about where we as an individual should be in terms of government. Quote, "But one of the first and most leading principles on which the Commonwealth and the laws are consecrated is lest the temporary possessors and life renters in it, unmindful of what they have received from their ancestors, or of what is due to their posterity, should act as if they were entire masters, that they should not think it amongst their rights to cut off an entail or commit waste on their inheritance, by destroying at their pleasure the whole original fabric of their society, hazarding to leave to those who come after them a ruin instead of a habitation, and teaching these successors as little to respect their contrivances as when they had themselves respected the institutions of their forefathers. By this unprincipled facility of changing the state as often and as much and in many ways as there are floating fancies or fashions, the whole chain of continuity of the Commonwealth would be broken. No one generation could link with another. Men would become little better than the flies of a summer." And I think that this is a really strong quote. that the adherence to tradition and the adherence to the work of our forefathers cannot be ignored. To simply say everything that came before is no longer worthwhile, you will find yourselves with no connection. You will be politically homeless, ideologically homeless, but most importantly, culturally homeless. Burke has such a valid point here that I think we need to definitely consider, especially nowadays when so many on the left continue their force of entropy, that we must adhere ourselves to the whims of this multicultural. We must abandon the traditions of the past. We must abandon these concepts, which are now deemed either sexist, homophobic, or white supremacist. All that this does is going to create an atomized and culturally isolated society with nothing that we can pass on to, destroying the very inheritance of this society. Burke's quote today about these leading principles of the English Commonwealth can be easily applied to the US and other parts of the West today. The destruction of what comes before ensures that you have nothing to pass on for the future. If you assume that you are a master of your lifestyle today, then what good are you to give them anything in the future? What is the point of having children if they themselves will simply destroy what you have created? You have ensured the destruction of your commonwealth and your society. Another part that he talks about is that, therefore, the evils of inconstancy and versatility, 10,000 times worse of those obstinacy of the blindest prejudice, how ye have consecrated the state, that no man should approach to look at its defects or corruptions but with due caution, that he should never dream of beginning its reformation by its subversion. End quote. The problem with Burke is that he is fundamentally fighting a rearguard action, and that history is vindicated that it is always will be a losing strategy. Yeah, and that's probably my biggest criticism of Burke, is that it is a rearguard action. And in fact, I mean, we've had others on the right talk about that we need to stop reacting to things, and then we need to just, take action. We can't just let them act and then we respond to it. Because, I mean, this is what this whole, pamphlet isn't merely just a response to what's going on. Mr. DuPont inquires to Edmund Burke, hey, what are you thinking? And we get this impressive treatise on what, the nature of the state is and what the nature of rights are and that they're inherited. However, of course, it is a rearguard action. It's reacting. It's not. It's responsive. It's not taking any necessary action to prevent it, which is why, I mean, a lot of the things that he says, Michael, you're right, are vindicated, but they're definitely a losing strategy. Academic Agent and Charlemagne pointed that out in their latest cigar stream, is that, the politics of reaction aren't going to get you anywhere. Now, I mean, if it's for profit motive, and I kind of talk about that in this Monday morning musing that'll come out later this afternoon, then yeah, like it's fine. But if you're thinking that you're actually doing something in terms of long-term political action, you're probably not. You're being disingenuous about it. That's the issue with any sort of rearguard action, is that you're usually doing it as a defensive or, losing retreat kind of strategy. Each generation must create. We must acknowledge our heritage, where we come from, and move forward. Jonathan Bowden is excellent on this. I have not read enough of Jonathan Bowden, but I'm going to add that to the reading list. But this, of course, is where Burke's discussion of the social contract and that concept from Locke is expanded on a little bit, where he sort of rejects the Lockean notion of that these are natural, but instead that these are inherited. Quote, society is indeed a contract. Subordinate contracts or objects of mere occasional interest may be dissolved at pleasure, but the state ought not to be considered as nothing better than a partnership agreement in a trade of pepper or coffee, calico or tobacco, or some other such low concern, to be taken up with little temporary interest, and to be dissolved by the fancy of the parties. It is to be looked on with reverence, because it is not a partnership in things subservient only to the gross animal existence of a temporary and perishable nature. It is a partnership in all science, in all art, and in every virtue and all perfection. As the ends of such a partnership cannot be obtained in many generations, it becomes a partnership not only between those who are living, but between those who are living, those who are dead, and those yet to be born. Each contract of each particular state is but a clause in the great primeval contract of eternal society, linking the lower with the higher natures, connecting the visible and invisible world, according to a fixed compact sanctioned by the inviolable oath which holds all physical and moral natures, each in their appointed place. This is the law not subject to the will of those who, by an obligation above them, and infinitely superior, are bound to submit their will to that law. The municipal corporations of that universal kingdom are not morally at liberty at their pleasure, and on the speculations of a contingent improvement, wholly to separate and tear asunder the bands of their subordinate community, and then to dissolve it into an unsocial, uncivil, and unconnected chaos of elementary principles. It is the first and supreme necessity only, a necessity that is not chosen but chooses, a necessity that is paramount to deliberation, and admits no exception to the rule, because this necessity itself is a part, too, of a moral and physical deposition of things in which man must be obedient by consent or by force, but if which is only a submission to things necessity should be made on that object of choice. The law is broken, nature is disobeyed, and the rebellious are outlawed, cast forth, and exiled from this world of reason, order, peace, virtue, and fruitful penitence, and an antagonist of a world of madness, discord, vice, confusion, and unavailing sorrow. End quote. So there's sort of a bit of Hobbesian view in there. Sort of a Hobbesian view that the state of nature and the state of man is inherently not a very pleasant one. The famous Hobbesian quote that life is brutal, British, and short, I think is what he describes the natural state of affairs when law is broken, and that we must obey these laws that we set aside. We cannot simply allow ourselves to abandon them, lest that we bring upon the very natural state of what man is. But Michael, you're absolutely right, though. It's definitely rear guard. These are observations of what happens when we break the rules, but not necessarily what can we do to ensure that the generations that come after us do so. Because I think Burke has a very valid observation when he's discussing the fact that these things are inherited, that our rights are inherited, that they are the efforts of our forebears and our forefathers. And to abandon them only invites a atomized, soulless world that we will eventually inherit, which is somewhat of what we've already seen now. And I think that Burke's observations, like many individuals in his time frame when discussing sort of criticisms of the Enlightenment and those principles, often prove to be prophetic. But from here, Burke transitions from his discussion about the nature of the state and begins to provide criticisms of the National Assembly. And of course, to which discusses how men must be men of, he discusses the difference between men of letters and men of action. Along with the moneyed interest, a new description of men has grown up, with whom an interest soon formed a close and marked union. I mean, the political men of letters. Men of letters, fond of distinguishing themselves, are rarely averse to innovation. Since the decline of the life and greatness of Louis XIV, they were not so much cultivated by either him or by the regent, or the successors to the crown, nor were they engaged to the court by favors or the annulments so systematically as during the splendid period of that ostentatious and impolitic reign. What they lost in the old court protection they endeavored to make up by joining in sort of an incorporation of their own, to which the two academies of France, and afterwards the vast undertaking of the encyclopedia, carried on by a society of these gentlemen, did not a little contribute. And he continues, the literary cabal had some years ago formed something like a regular plan for the destruction of the Christian religion. This object they pushed with a degree of zeal which hitherto had been discovered only in the propagators of some system of piety. They were possessed with a spirit of proselytism in the most fanatical degree, from thence, by easy progress, with the spirit of persecution, according to their means. which was not done towards by their great end with any direct or immediate act, be wrought by a long process through the medium of opinion. To command that opinion, the first step is to establish a dominion over those who direct it. They contrive to possess themselves with great method and perseverance of all avenues of literary fame. Many of them, indeed, stood high in the ranks of literature and science. The world had done them justice, and in favor and general talents forgave their evil tendency of their peculiar principles. This was true liberality, which they returned by endeavoring to confine the reputation of sense, learning, and taste to themselves and or their followers. I will venture to say this narrow, exclusive spirit has been less prejudicial to literature and to taste than to morals and true philosophy. These atheistical fathers have a bigotry of their own, and they have learned to talk against monks with the spirit of a monk. But in some things they are men of the world. The resources of intrigue are called in to supply the defects of argument and wit. To this system of their literary monopoly was joined with an unremitting industry to blacken and discredit in every way, and by every means all those who did not hold unto their faction. To those who have observed the spirit of their conduct, it has been clear that nothing was wanted but the power of carrying the intolerance of the tongue and the pen into a persecution that would strike at property, liberty, and life. End quote. Now, this is clearly an attack on sort of the Enlightenment secular principles that we see that comes into the form of modern liberalism. These individuals attacking the monk with the same, zeal of a monk, the same faith of a monk. We see that even today with the sort of secular neoliberalism that is, common in woke politics, that we must attack the Christian religion, that we must attack the structures of government and faith with our pamphlets, our essays, and everything. This sort of got really popular with the new atheist movement, about a decade ago, and Christopher Hitchens was still around. And of course, Richard Dawkins was doing his work earlier, and we're seeing it even back then. And yet we, of course, have done nothing about it. But I love that line. These atheistical fathers have a bigotry of their own, which, of course, even to this day, that bigotry still stands. So let's see how the comments are doing. Oh, we're talking about loud and quiet activism. But yeah, so this is how Reflections has been ashamed to have been a new atheist, started praying again. I think that's really the modern story, I think, of many people who come to the right wing nowadays, is that there is an acknowledgement that, like so many, we've been socialized, especially in the West, to rebel. That inner idea of eternal liberation or the eternal revolution that the left has successfully managed to mandate and subvert the idea of incremental change of classical conservatism, which Burke adheres to, that we must rebel, that we must liberate ourselves from tradition and try to forge our own path. And so many times, like the biblical story of the prodigal son, those who come to the right wing, especially in modern times, are in many ways prodigal children. When I hear other people on the right, even on the reactionary side, even Charlemagne, right? He talks about his recent return to Catholicism. I've talked about on this channel and on streams and in other videos, my recent return to Christianity. And there is a great comfort in it, in part because when you go off topic, or off the beaten path of tradition and ideas, you are alone. And like I had mentioned earlier, when Burke is talking about forging your own path, you are pushing away yourself from your forebears and your ancestors. You will have nothing to pass on. So there are so many of us who on the right come back to the faith, come back to these traditional ideas, not because they're hip or trendy or lindy as the term goes, but because it gives us something to actually adhere to. It gives us something to actually have structure to. Like in the last stream, we were, DC Perspective and I were talking about our ideas about being white-pilled. And, DC Perspective talks about, being eternally white-pilled because he has his faith. And I think, to me, that's a very powerful statement of what makes someone on the right a right-winger, is that we have these things that are structures that exist beyond the mortal coil that we can adhere to. One of the greatest things that separates, I think, the left and the right in terms of looking at life is this teleological perspective of, when we die, have we done things that ensures others in our family and our neighbors and our community will tell us that man lived a good life? And I think that's what separates us from the left. The right recognizes that we have things to do in this world that will make sure that we've lived a good life, whether that's having a family, building a strong community in a neighborhood and a church and congregation, whereas the left is more focused on the material. The left likes to confuse the material as something systemic, whereas they're more focused on the immediate needs around them. That's why the left is the politics of envy, the politics of entropy, the things that will eventually fade away, the things that we wish to fade away, because they do not materially have the things that they want. Whereas we know that there are things that are extra material that we must adhere to, whether that's tradition, whether that's faith, whether that's the founding principles of a constitution or a country, although our written constitution hasn't necessarily been adhered to in some time. But that is definitely what separates us quite clearly from the left. And I think that's what makes Burke's writing so important, even to this day. Even if you're a reactionary, right? Even if you are full-on NRX and, Burke's idea of incremental change is something that we should resist. Burke's idea that these rights and the nature of a being and people and hierarchy coming from our forebears is something that we must adhere to. We make the meme on Twitter all the time, return to tradition, but returning to tradition can only matter if we actually respect that tradition and to begin with. And I think, as Michael had pointed out, originally being a new atheist, it's in coming back to praying, I think it tells us so much about ourselves, about our own political journeys, that coming back to those traditions, coming back to those structures that are extra material, that are not just physical, tangible things, but are in fact these great metaphysical, epistemological concepts of how we address our own first principles, are things that we must hold on to. And failure to hold on to them leaves us incredibly vulnerable to becoming a aimless, atomized, and lost people. And for many in this country, we are now living with people that are lost and atomized. And it's not that we should pity them, but we should treat them with the opportunity to let them know that there is an alternative. As I had mentioned in my last video, I Have Not Yet Begun, we must be paragons in our own communities. We must be the shining examples. It is not enough to simply say, I am anti-progressive. It is not enough to say that I am against the left and everything that the left does. No. You must have your own values. You must adhere to your own traditions. You must adhere to what came before you and stick to what works. Failure to do so means that we are nothing more than, as Burke had described, flies of the summer. We are simply going to be buzzing around the very shit that we see coming out of the left, when quite obviously we should be doing something better, which is getting married, having kids, letting our children know of what came before us and what will come after us. And I think that's why Burke, to me, is such a fundamental, reading and treatise to actually get started with. Not to mention Burke's time in the House of Commons is really indicative of what I believe traditional conservative statesmen can look like. Whether it's the conservative argument for the abolition of slavery, whether it's adhering to the idea that those who engage in such immoral practices have no right in representing the common man, for those who are of morals cannot be people of service to others. And of course, we all serve higher purposes, whether that's service to God, service to community and family. It's important that we read on with these things. That's why I call this Prudent Reads, this live stream book club series for all of you, is because I think it's prudent that we look to the past for these understandings. Burke is not perfect in his analysis. Burke rejects the idea that political theories can explain everything, that the nature of mankind is far too complex, and to an extent he's arguably right, but at the same time, I don't think Burke could have foresaw modern developments in social sciences and psychology. I mean, for instance, all the work that the YouTuber Aiden Paladin makes is a really great way to understand a lot of the nature of politics and psychology, and I don't think it's something that Burke's, had at his time. And while he argues that there's no theory that really explains everything, and I would disagree, I think that our analysis of power and the theory of how power is deviated, especially within the Moldbuggian sense of the cathedral and how the cathedral exercises power, I think, however, Burke is right that humans are complex and that we must acknowledge sort of the realpolitik. And he mentions Machiavellian here. And those are things to consider. Michael says, exactly. And this is prompting me to find out more about my Irish history and background. Excellent point and well said. Well, thank you. So I will do a few more pages of reading, and then I'll open everything up for discussion, and then we'll do some announcements and get towards the end here. So we'll flip through the pages. I had some stuff on here. Some quotations about the monarchy I think was interesting. Quote, "But the nobility of France are degenerated since the days of Henry IV. This is possible, but it is more than I can believe to be true in any great degree. I do not pretend to know France as correctly as some others, but I have endeavored through my whole life to make myself acquainted with human nature. Otherwise, I should be unfit to even humble in part in the service of mankind. In that study, I could not pass by a vast portion of our nature as it appeared modified in a country but 24 miles from the shore of this island. On my best observation, compared with its best inquiries, I found your nobility for greater part composed of men of high spirit and with a delicate sense of honor, both with regard of themselves individually and with regard to the whole corps, over whom they kept, and beyond what is common in other countries, a censorial eye. They were tolerably well bred. They were very officious, humane, and hospitable, and their conversation frank and open, and with good military tone, and reasonably tinctured in with literature, particularly of the authors in their own language. Many had pretensions far above this description. I speak for those who were generally met with." End quote. And this is sort of the discussion of the nobility within France and how, since the times of Henry IV and how it had declined. But he states that many of the men of the higher classes of the French nobility were well-read. They were well-bred. These were people that were meant to be there. They were of the spirit and means to do so. This is, of course, where he is comparing that to the National Assembly. That members of the Third Estate were not necessarily presenting themselves in any way or means of being well-bred or having the means to do so. In fact, he's got a really good line about the Third Estate and those who represent the National Assembly, talking about their character and their confidence. And he brings them down pretty well, saying that he doesn't see any men in there that are actually worth holding these positions of power. Trying to find it now. There we go. Here we go. "As I had read over the list in persons and descriptions elected into the Third Estate, nothing which afterwards they could appear astonishing. Among them, indeed, I saw some of known rank, some of shining talents, but of any practical experience in the state not one man was to be found. The best were only of men of theory. But whatever the distinguished few there may have been, it is the substance and mass of the body which constitutes its character, and must finally determine its direction." End quote. And I think that that's a very valid comparison of that of the nobility and that of the Third Estate. And we're kind of seeing that now in today's political realm, especially amongst that of the left, is that they are men of theory, not men of action. I think that's why you get that age-old comparison about talking about the left and right, about protest, is that, where are the right-wing protests? And although recently the right has begun to protest more, the common quip is that the right has to go to work in the morning, whereas the left doesn't. And I think that still holds true to very much this day, even on our political dichotomies that exist now in contemporary times, is that you have on the right usually men who are employed either in a working class situation or in a very technical specific background, entryism. People like Charlemagne are in, computer science. The distributist is an engineer. Academic agent was an academic, and of course worked in a very high technical field. And the left doesn't have that. We take a look at the prominent individuals of the left. Whether that's Philosophy Tube or ContraPoints or Vosh, what are they? They are men and women of theory. They are men and women who make this their full-time job, who engage in politics of words. They are men and women of letters, whereas the men and women of the right are not. They're men and women of action, men and women of principle, of homemakers, of that of faith and piety. There's a distinct difference between the left and the right that has been discussed for years. And Burke adequately points that out, is that we have these men of theory, most of them of little to no actual substance or value as to who they are, yet still have some sort of claim for, what they're meant to be. They aren't even men of theory, lol. That is true. They're not men of theory of their own. I mean, they are men of someone else's theory, typically that of Marx and other postmodernists, and the discussion of what that is. They are men and women of theory in the extent that they are men and women of bell hooks. They are men and women of Kimberly Crenshaw, men and women of Noam Chomsky, Stanley Dietz, and others. Not to say that those theories aren't necessarily bad. It's that, they are inherently. They're entropic and typically evil, but it's not like all of them are. Chomsky and Dietz, when talking about things such as manufactured consent or corporate colonization, can give us an understanding as to how the cathedral operates. And we mustn't necessarily throw leftist ideas on the window without examining them, just based on prima facie observations. We should interrogate these ideas and understand them. That's why I've mentioned in the past that we must understand, individuals that we may disagree with, as well as we understand those that we appreciate. Just like I have my copies of Carlyle and Burke next to my copies of Derrida or Chomsky. They're essential for us to understand, because not all of them are wrong in their observations. It's maybe their application of said theory that can be problematic. You make valid points about men of theory. However, we should not forget that we need to weave our own stories and versions of events. Yes. And actually, I kind of talk about that in my Monday morning musing that will be coming out after this live stream. We're going to be talking about the importance of calling out hypocrisy. I sort of talk about how it's not an effective political weapon, but calling out hypocrisy allows us to create a collective historical narrative and database. So we have our own version of events of what actually went down as sort of this counter-establishment narrative. The right cannot claim to be men of action if the top figures of the right are Ben Shapiro, Steven Crowder, and the Daily Wire people who get all their money from politics, yet don't use their resources to accomplish goals. The establishment right, like Con Inc., they're not men of action. Con Inc. are the kind of people that will happily cling and clutch to their pearls and say that at least I have my principles while the world is destroyed around them. People like Don the Pleb, who actually go out to protest, talk to people, organize. People like Conscious Caracol with AfriForum in South Africa. Those people are men of action and actually do things. It is important for us to be activists in our own right. And like I had mentioned in my I Have Not Yet Begun video, that it doesn't require you to be a man of action in some grand idea in the grand narrative of history. You can be a man or a woman of action by being a homemaker, by being a good neighbor, by participating in a city council meeting or at a PTA board meeting. The little things, yes, matter. And there are ways to be men of action that can greatly improve the status of your community by just participating. There's a guy on Twitter I really like following. His name is Inductivist. He's got a profile picture of Abraham Lincoln. And a lot of the things he talks about, he says, a lot of the problems that you're seeing would be solved if you people got off your ass and just went to like a city council meeting. And I think he's right, because I guarantee you that quite a few people don't participate in those things. And as I've mentioned before, the greatest difference between a left-leaning young person and a right-leaning young person is that the right-leaning person will typically coordinate with communities online, whereas the left-leaning person has no problem signing up at the DNC and knocking on doors for their favorite candidate, Bernie Sanders. And that's why it's important for us to be these men of actions. We have to weave our own stories and versions of events, like Michael is saying. But in order to do so, we actually have to weave our own stories. We actually have to act. We actually have to move on and get up from that. I hope that the things that I'm doing here is some sort of weaving of stories and events. We look back to the past and we try and find ways that make sense of what's gone on in the world. And what a better way to do that than to acknowledge and respect the past and use the traditions of our forefathers in order to advance our own values and principles in a society that has so far drifted away from those principles and those values. So in order to accomplish goals, we must act. We must acknowledge what comes before us and learn. So, like I said, I hope that this is doing something. I hope that you're learning something here, and I hope that we're having a good conversation. But I'll read a few more quotations that I had highlighted in my text here, and then we'll get close to wrapping up. So here we're getting more of Burke's description of the importance of incrementalism and, of course, the adherence of tradition and preservation of the state. Quote, "At once to preserve and to reform is quite another thing. When the useful parts of an old establishment are kept, and what is superadded to be fitted with what is retained, a vigorous mind, steady, preserving attention, various powers of comparison and combination, and the resources of an understanding, fruitful in its expedients, are to be exercised. They are to be exercised in a continued conflict with the combined force of opposite vices, with the obstinacy that rejects all improvement, and the levity that is fatigued and disgusted with everything of which it is in its possession. But you may object. A process of this is slow. It is not fit for an assembly which glories in performing in a few months of the work of ages. Such a mode of reforming possibly might take up many years. Without question it might, and it ought. It is one of the excellences of the method in which this time is amongst its assistants, that its operation is slow, and in some cases almost imperceptible. If circumspection and caution are part of wisdom, when we work upon inanimate matter, surely they become part of duty too, when the subject of our demolition and construction is not brick and timber, but sentient beings, by sudden alteration of whose state, condition, and habits, multitudes may be rendered miserable. But it seems as if it were the prevalent opinion in Paris that the unfeeling heart and undoubting confidence are the sole qualifications of a perfect legislature. Far different are my ideas of that of high office. The true lawgiver ought to have a heart full of sensibility. He ought to love and respect his kind and to fear himself, and may be allowed to his temperament to catch his ultimate object with the intuitive glance. But movements towards ought to be deliberate. Political arrangement, as it is the work of social ends, is to be wrought by social means. Their mind must conspire with mind. Time is required to produce a union of minds which alone can produce all the good we aim at. Our patience will achieve more than our force. If I might venture to appeal what might come out of such fashion in Paris, I mean to experience, I should tell you, that in my course I have known according to my measure, have cooperated with great men, and I have never yet seen any plan which has not been mended by the observations of those who were much inferior in understanding to the person that took the lead in the business. By a slow but well-sustained progress, the effect of each step is watched, the good or ill success which first gives light to us in the second, and so on, light to light. We are conducted with the safety through the whole series." End quote. And I think that really tells us what we need to know from Burke. Is that we must be cautious with every step that we take. And it's the fundamental nature of all aspect of conservatism is that while change may be an inevitable factor of human nature, we mustn't allow ourselves to be carried on with the whims and fancies of change. The appeal to novelty must be adequately rejected at all costs. We cannot allow ourselves to do things on flights of fancy. And of course, with the National Assembly, we have the fundamental rights of man, of course, Robespierre's famous essay on terror, and the eventual death of 20,000 Frenchmen, and of course the wars that would come out of there, and eventually what would happen would be the rise of Napoleon. Burke, of course, is right when we acknowledge the concerns of speed and accelerationism. We must be always cautious of accelerationism, for we do not know what may come next, because you are abandoning tradition, you are abandoning caution and reason. You are abandoning what has allowed you to get where you are now. And in fact, there are quite a few people that talk about accelerationism in such a manner. The famous French postmodernist Paul Virilio discusses this and the concept of the integral accident, that with any acceleration of technological, societal, or philosophical advancement, you are leaving yourself more vulnerable and more open to the idea of an accident occurring. The discovery of every new idea and new technology comes with the discovery of its accident and its dangers. And such comes with the nature of rapid accelerationism, is that you are most likely to derail the train. You are most likely to go off track from what you can control, and in doing so, leave yourself vulnerable to an unmitigated disaster that you have no ability to contain or mitigate. Which is why I think the most basic aspect of Burkean prudentialism, of being prudent in our forethought and adhering to tradition, even if we do need to change, because technology does advance. Society advances in new ways of organization of people. In order to do so, it must be done cautiously. For failure to take our foot off the brake and just see what happens puts us in grave danger as a society and as a culture. And it puts the very machinations of how government functions at greater risk of being no longer in our control, which very clearly is very true in today's means. The government in which we have in the United States is not in control of its people, but by a very select oligarchical class, the iron law of oligarchy in action. But of course, the things that were done to mitigate that are no longer in place. And in fact, we have given the illusion of the popular wills of the people to be put in place, even though we've replaced our original aristocratic means of indirect democracy and have replaced it with manufactured consent and corporate astroturfed popular wills. That's why, of course, you can never really take the trending section of Twitter seriously. But I'll finish off with some of the readings here with a line about the king. A king circumstanced as the present, if he is totally stupefied by his misfortunes, so as to think it not the necessity but the premium and privilege of life, to eat and sleep without any regard to glory, can never be fit for the office. If he feels as men commonly feel, he must be sensible that he is an office, so circumstanced is one to which he can obtain no fame or reputation. He has no generous interest that can excite him into action. At best, his conduct will be passive and defensive. To inferior people, such an office might be a matter of honor, but to be raised to it and to descend to it are different things, and to suggest different sentiments. Does he really name his ministers? They will have sympathy with him. Are they forced upon him? The whole business between them and the nominal king will be mutual counteraction. In all countries, the office of ministers of state is of the highest dignity. In France, it is full of peril, incapable of glory. Rivals, however, they will have in their nothingness, whilst shallow ambition exists in the world, or the desire of a miserable salary as an incentive to the short-sighted avarice. End quote. And I think that really tells us the importance of our relationship to men who are wishing to be men of action. If you do not recognize the position that you have been thrust upon, if you do not recognize the position in which you are in, then what good has it become? What good are you to lead? If you do not recognize that you are now withholding or inheriting an office of great men and women that came before you, acknowledging that the things before you are not trivial matters and do not matter, then what good are you to lead in that position? How are you to, ascertain authority or respect if all that you see this is simply a position of, an ability to garner a salary or garner a wealth? It's the same thing that can be applied in even your workspace and your jobs at home or wherever you may be working at, including your hobbies and in your trades. If you do not respect the position in the office in which you hold, what good will you do in order to garner the respect of anyone else? And such men of the Enlightenment, as Burke critiques, who are atheistic and wishing to challenge these existing structures have no more of the wills and ideas, for simply they are men of theory who wish to attain wealth and materialists, and not necessarily the glory and the value and the honor that comes with it. And to me, I think that that's a fundamental observation that Burke makes, that anyone on the right, whether you're reactionary, a Christian conservative, a distributist, an integralist, whatever you may be, acknowledging the honor and the past glories that come with any position, office, trade, skill, or craft that you learn is essential to recognize and to honor. Because if you look at it like, oh, it's just a paycheck, oh, it's just something that I do, oh, it's just a hobby, when it's something so much more than that, we leave ourselves vulnerable to having those subvert it for their own means, and for us to not garner respect and to garner authority that we rightfully need when it comes to being a leader and a member of our community or our communities of groups and whatever we participate in. So for the 16 of you all that are here, what do you guys think so far? I would love to hear your thoughts and comments. This is the first time that we're doing this sort of book club thing, but now that we have our book selected for next month, you guys can also read and join me next time, both in the chat and maybe even on stream as we talk about the book and express our thoughts and sort of go on tangents about what we learned from the readings and so on. To me, Burke is a quintessential reading for anyone on the right, whether you're going to just have normie conservative, conserva boomer opinions, or you're going to have more neoconservative opinions, or neo-reactionary opinions. I think that Burke is still an important starting point to establish some first principles. Burke sounds like a genius. Burke is responding. He's reflecting on things as the pamphlet entails. He's not by any means perfect. There's a lot of the reactionary criticism, right, of Burke is that, incrementalism leads you to be subverted. It's sort of like the, like a boulder being washed against the shore and the tide. Every tide is going to take something away and away until eventually there's nothing, which I think is a very valid criticism with incremental change, is that eventually, yeah, it might be a small piece of ideas or a small concession, but it'll eventually be far more in the future. Do you think that the pamphlet is more of a piece of clever and well-written rhetoric rather than presenting much of an actual political philosophy? It's more of a presentation of his a critique of brash action. It's more of it's a response. It's not necessarily a political philosophy, because Burke is famously rejects political philosophy. Burke believes that human nature is far too complex for one political philosophy or one political theory to sort of explain everything, which of course is counterintuitive to the very nature of most political philosophy, that we do have theories and ideas in which explains the world. The NRX idea of the neo-reactionary trichotomy or the cathedral, these are the concepts that we use to create to explain things and have a political philosophy. Burke outright rejects those. So I would say that it's more of a well-written series of observations than it is outlining a political philosophy, because he's not a big fan of that. Modern day blogging is like old school pamphleteering, something shorter and more concise. Good choice. Yeah, I would agree. And I mean, the nice thing about modern day blogging is that you can you can always continually publish, right? Like, it's not just sending one pamphlet out and then you're done. It can be something that is continuously updated. It is a stream of consciousness, and it allows you to document the evolution of ideas, which I think is nice. Calling yourself a reactionary is giving into the term of the left and acknowledges your worldview and framing. No one should identify as a reactionary. The term is poison. We need to play the language game. I would disagree with that. I think that the left's idea of calling someone a reactionary is meant to be used in a pejorative sense, in the same way that me calling someone a leftist is pejorative. There is reason to be called reactionary and to be necessarily to not view it necessarily as a bad thing, or to be playing the left's language game. I mean, the term reactionary wasn't necessarily even taken. I don't even think it was necessarily subverted by the left or used as a leftist pejorative when the term was really being envisioned and created by some of the great reactionary thinkers of the past, whether that be G.K. Chesterton or Thomas Carlyle. I mean, they're definitely reactionary, and I don't think that they necessarily viewed it as a bad thing or that they were playing a language game of the left. I don't think that the term is as poisonous as you think, Pedro. And Michael, I agree with you. Blogging allows you to focus on more than one important topic, whereas traditional pamphleteering, definitely not. The most important question is would Burke have bought GME stock? I don't know. I don't think so. I think Burke would definitely probably tell you that wild and rampant speculation for the purposes of trying to strike down a political institution is probably a bad idea and will bring about more negative consequences than it would positive ones. That's where I sort of disagree with some aspects of Burke, is that populism has a place. Populism definitely has a place, especially when conservative populism and right-wing populism is typically done in response to preserve or at least reborn or to provide a rebirth of institutional meanings and to provide, or at least to take back the institutions. For those of you who've been following me for any length of period of time, you know for me that the culture war is a two-front war. Those who wish to retake institutions in whichever way they can, and those who are trying to build parallel competing institutions so we are not completely silenced. You can't do one without the other. Reactionary or dissident / revolutionary conservative might fit also. I like the term dissident, but at the same time, dissident means that you're probably not doing anything. You're just responding to things. And that's why I like avoiding the term dissident. Revolutionary conservative might fit. But the question becomes, what's the end goal of the revolution? So like if you're an NRX guy, I would imagine that you're probably pushing for more of that neo-cameralist patchwork sort of solution that Moldebug provides, or you wish to go back to some form of like 18th century American federalism, which is why, again, I think reactionary is still a term that is acceptable to find. Easy to find conservatives. They have Trump flags and American flags outside their houses. Yeah, they definitely do. I live in a rural part of North Texas, and there are still Trump flags all over the place. I don't think people are going to be putting them down anytime soon, especially when so many normie Republicans have bought onto the idea that things were not done, let's just say, legitimately in terms of what happened in November. Have you read any Russell Kirk? Yes, I have, actually. I have read quite a bit of Russell Kirk back in college. Definitely well known for his positions as a traditionalist conservative. Russell Kirk I liked because he was a critique, I believe. He was well known for his critique of fusionism, which is what I really like Kirk for. Kirk is very skeptical of the modern conservative fusionism of libertarian and conservative ideals. And I think Kirk has been vastly vindicated when we look at the fact that the modern right seems to be more focused with the GDP kind of deals rather than the values in which brought us to where we are as conservatives. I live in a not so rural part of NC, and there are signs and flags all over the place. Yeah. Trump flags ensure that the left won't notice pamphleting. I'm tempted to found some sort of exclusive society or association for men. If one group in society actually needed help in championing, it's men. Michael, I suggest that you do it. I've been very adamant that while there are those out there that think that we shouldn't vote or participate in politics, I think that there are ways that you can be involved politically that actually make a difference. And I think men's clubs, book clubs like this are the way to do it. That would be the way to go. I think that if you're going to actually do it, you should, and I say that you go for it. Do it in your area, and if you want to make it digital, go for it. I know that there are a lot of conservative and sort of anti-progressive activists that talk about this sort of stuff that are philosophy based. Jack Murphy's a really good example. He has that. I think it's called the Liminal Order, and it's sort of this sort of like international organization that brings people together. They talk about philosophy, they talk about politics. He's got a show, Jack Murphy Live. So I know they do stuff like that. For pamphleting, just look for flags and gather the addresses and then send them to pamphlets in the mail through the USPS. So if you want to actually make that easier, what you can do, Pedro, is that you can get involved with your local like party office, and you can, want to be a door knocker or something like that. Then you would have access to voter registration data and how those people voted. That way you can know where to mail your pamphlets. I guess if it's decentralized, I would be too concerned with getting the Proud Boys treatment. Yeah, I mean, it needs to be decentralized. Decentralization is a very effective way to ensure that the leadership and as well as the general group overall isn't subverted or infiltrated. I mean, the Proud Boys, apparently Enrique Tarrio was a Fed. I mean, I'm kind of not surprised. But I mean, to me, it's indicative that as soon as like Gavin McInnes left it and began to disavow it for legal reasons, that it was going to be easily taken over by glowies. And so you gotta have everything that's decentralized. Dan says, just don't have a rule against women joining. Instead, found a chess club or something named that so no women would think to join. See, that's the thing, is that like if you're gonna do some sort of men's club or anything like that, go to spaces that are traditionally already inhabited by majority men. And for most men nowadays that are 35 and under, gaming is the way to go. And if you want men with a disposable income, then tabletop gaming is the way to go. So there you go. That would be, just go towards traditionally male spaces if that's what you want to do. Even if you have all your names on a list or something like that and it gets leaked to Antifa, that's a big deal. Yeah, I mean, that's the point. Like, you can't have it centralized, including the information. It's as simple as how it goes. But I want to thank you all for coming by. We need to create conservative women. They're almost all lefties now. Yeah, the way that you create conservative women is that you marry them and you make families. Most married women with children, if they were the only ones voting, it would have been a like 300 something landslide for Trump on the Electoral College. So I mean, conservative women, you make them homemakers. I know that it's very difficult, but yeah, you can't make them conservative in the traditional sense that men are. Men and women are inherently different. Not to mention, the whole 1993 meme about no women born after that year. Do I have announcements? Yes, I have announcements. I do. So as I'm going to get close to wrapping up this stream, I want to thank you all for coming. And let's do some announcements. So this was Prudent Reads number 1. I thought that this was a pretty good trial run for how things to go. I'm going to do some notes, and I will hope that you guys will put some comments on what I can do to improve. And of course, you can just DM me on Twitter and tweet at me and let me know what I can do better about this so we can improve. But I have the next Prudent Reads set for March 1st. The book I will be reading this month is The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of the World Order by Samuel P. Huntington. If you have a copy of the book, I highly recommend that you join us in reading it and having an opportunity to talk about the book and your thoughts there. I'm looking forward to discussing it because it's a book based on foreign policy, and I love talking about foreign affairs and international relations. So if you want, I have no problem having the audience come on stream. I'll invite you into the Streamlabs and we can talk about it. And we can all take turns and bring people in and out and we can all have conversations. So I think it'll be great. So that'll be on March 1st. So the next thing is my Monday Morning Musings has been recorded and uploaded. I have it scheduled for a premiere later this afternoon after the stream. I'll probably bump it up so you can watch it right after I sign off. And we can continue there. I will have a video hopefully on Thursday or Friday uploaded. It will be talking about the concept of Lindy. And I think that it'll be a fun conversation about showing our work as to why our ideas stand the test of time. So I again want to thank you all for being here. This is the start of a monthly thing that I hope to continue. The growth the last few weeks has been phenomenal, and I'm really happy with it so far. And thank you for joining me on my own political journey. I'm still figuring everything out as I read more and come to change my understanding of the world around me, but I'm glad that you all are here to come around. It's definitely been a lot of fun. So I will see you all in the next video, which will be premiering in just a few minutes. And I'll see you all next time, guys. Until then, be prudent, everybody.